Well, good morning and welcome to another installment of Doctor in Wonderland, the adventures of a clinical psychologist in the family courts. Now, in this section, or in this today, I'm going to be discussing my descent down the rabbit hole. Uh, in the previous video, I discussed the real world, okay, where I came from, my background, delusional thought disorders, and attachment, early childhood, child abuse, complex trauma. And then I went into private practice and got a client from a minors council. Normally, I would say no to those. But in this case, I decided to see what's up in the family courts. Let's have a look at this. So I took one patient, took the client out of the family courts. I had the diagnosis within the first session, and I confirmed it in a meeting session with the father. And then I started my treatment for the cross-generational coalition, shared persecutory delusion, and factitious disorder. The dad had himself inserted into my therapy by court order, which would absolutely decimate the therapy if I'm trying to restore with mom and dad or with mom and the child, and the dad has himself inserted to monitor make sure nothing happens. And so that's where the courts will absolutely decimate any attempt at therapy. And clinical psychologists know that. We know that the court will prevent any therapy for the pathology. We know the pathology is narcissistic borderline personality pathology in a parent, and who's activated around the divorce, are very retaliatory. If we try to interfere with what they want to do, they're going to come after us and file licensing board complaints and things like that. So, no clinical psychologists work in the family courts. But I came back. I was old guy. I was approaching retirement, and I'd worked with every other pathology. I wanted to see what's out here in the family courts. So I accepted this client. Over the Christmas break, the dad, because I told the dad, you're causing the pathology, and when we come back, I'm going to ask you to release the child. And so when over the Christmas break, the dad developed a factitious anxiety disorder, and the child got the child to report that he's anxious about Dr. Childress's therapy. Actually, kid was falling asleep in my therapy. The moment dad had himself put in, I stopped paying attention to the child and focused on dad. So he took the kid to the emergency room, said, oh, the child's anxious about therapy with Dr. Childress. The ER person said, doctor said, here's some anxiety medication, and perhaps you should, change therapists. Dad took that back to family court, terminated my therapy. Now, the judge never asked me anything. Minors counsel never asked me anything. Nobody ever asked me anything. They just inserted that in my therapy and then removed me from treatment when the child said, oh, I don't like Dr. Childress. So that's where I left the previous session. Okay, so coming up to the rabbit hole and then tripped, and now we're going to go down the hole. So given that situation, my therapy is terminated, but you don't do that with one of my kids. Okay, so I'm going to stay on the case. One, trying to get proper treatment for the kid. This is child abuse. Why isn't the court responding to child abuse? And so I began to look into what's happening in the family courts. And now, from my background, I'm trained in community clinical psychology. So I'm trained in how to change community systems to treat a pathology. So now I have the family courts that's not responding to a delusional thought disorder, to child abuse. And so I'm wondering, what's factitious disorder? What's happening here with the system that's not the mental health system in the family courts? So I got two systems, mental health system and the family courts. Now, the first thing that we would do as a consultant, if I was brought in as a consultant to fix the systems, to fix the pathology, is up with identify the problem. What's going on in the systems? So, for example, Jim Swanson, when I was working with Jim Swanson on ADHD and the countywide project, I had an idea. We're working grant projects, so we got a little funding. It's not based on billable hours. And so I went to Jim and I said, "Hey, Jim, one of the criteria of ADHD is functional impairment. If we go into the preschools and give teacher training on how to respond to the child, we can actually get rid of the symptoms because of the improved quality of the preschool teachers and cure ADHD. There's no functional impairment anymore if we teach the preschool teachers how to respond." And so I'd like permission to do a teacher training component as part of my job duties. And he said, "Okay, go for it." And that gives an indication of his power. He said, "I'll put you in touch with the head of Head Start." Great. So I went to the head of Head Start in the county and had a meeting with another psychologist from Jim's program, Steve Simpson. So Steve and I, we were going to head up the teacher training component. We went and talked to the director of Head Start about, what do you need? What do the preschool teachers need? And there's a high turnover rate. There's all sorts of skill sets and things that they need. And that's a needs assessment. That's the first thing you start with. What's going on in the system? So you start by learning. And one of the things, they don't do applied behavioral analysis because they don't do rewards and punishments in early childhood. They do something called developmentally appropriate practice. It's guidance-based. It's not behaviorally based. So it's two totally different things. So instead of doing applied behavioral analysis, we did functional behavioral analysis that blended better with what the philosophy is in early childhood. So that's the type of thing and I've taught this type of stuff, evaluation research, so at graduate level. So you come in and the first thing you do is find out what's going on. You talk to the various people. So in the family courts, what I started to do is read the literature. What's going on? Tell me what's going on, starting with the parental alienation, because I ran into that. First time I'd ever heard it. Ran into parental alienation. And I said, well, what is this thing? Looked into it. The diagnostic indicators out of Gardner are awful. So it's bad. We had this one psychiatrist back in the 80s recognize one aspect of it, the borderline mom and the high anxiety and false allegations, totally missed the narcissistic dad spectrum. And this one psychiatrist, so the psychiatrist, no offense to psychiatrists, but you're not trained in clinical therapy. You're not trained in, cross-generational coalitions or in the attachment system. He should have noted the delusional thought disorder, but again, for some factitious disorder, but for some reason he didn't. And what Gardner did is he gave himself permission to leave professional standards of practice. We don't make up new pathology. No. So all the critics of Gardner and PAS are 100% correct. That was a bad thing to do, to leave standard practice. And you say, is it in the DSM? No, it's not. So we needed to stay within the DSM. Now, if you look in the DSM, it's a shared psychotic disorder, and it's a factitious disorder imposed on another. So it is in the DSM if you apply it. But nobody applied it because they gave themselves permission. Now, the reason that's a bad thing to do is look what's happened over 40 years. Everybody's been fighting about whether there's parental alienation a made-up thing. And so it's kept the entire field locked up in fighting rather than applying the DSM, which it is already in. It's just lazy. That's what Gardner did. He was just lazy. He didn't understand something. So instead of staying restrained and contained within established knowledge and figuring it out. He just said, it's too hard for me. I'm going to create a whole new pathology with 8 entirely new symptoms that don't have nothing to do with anything else in psychology. So this parental alienation, that we don't know what the treatment is, it doesn't connect to any other pathology. Bad thing to do. So that's one side of things. But at least that side recognizes there's this pathology here, that this is a false, factitious pathology. They're just really bad. They're incompetent. They're lazy, ignorant. And then when I look at the professionals there, I say, who do we have over here? We have basically Gardner, who's a psychiatrist, no attachment background, no therapy background. Okay, where's my psychologist? We have the leadership of that back in 2010, 2012 was Bill Burnett. And so he's a psychiatrist. So we got 2 psychiatrists when we have an attachment pathology, which should be a psychologist. And then we have some master's degrees running around, Gottlieb and, a few other master's degrees. Lorandos is the only PhD. And so, I've even got lawyers at the time, back 2010, 2012, lawyers who are experts in parental alienation and stuff and making recommendations of what. Lawyers have no training in pathology. Psychiatrists have no training in therapy or attachment. And like, what is going on over here? And they're just making stuff up. The problem, I come out of child abuse. The problem with making up a new pathology like parental alienation, it's a euphemism that hides the child abuse. If we say it's a factitious disorder, that's child abuse. And we should be using the word child abuse. But we're not. We're using parental alienation, which masks it. And I go, that's odd. Okay, that's the wrong thing to do, to use euphemism for child abuse, because it hides it. It hides it from the court, hides it from effective intervention for the child abuse, because we're arguing with parental alienation. So that's a problem. So I look at all the research literature, and I agree 100% with all the critics of PAS. It's bad, bad, bad. We need to stop it, go away, and we need to get back to the DSM. However, my follow-up on that is, yes, that is bad. It's not in the DSM. We need to apply the DSM. So where are my psychologists who should be applying the DSM? Okay, I got psychiatrists as master's people. Where are my psychologists in the family courts? What are they doing? And so that's when I turned back to the forensic psychologists and started to read their literature about this new forensic custody approach and what their guidelines were and what they think they're doing. And they're highly problematic. First, they did not apply the DSM-5. So it's interesting that you're a critic that's not in. Well, then you do it. You apply the DSM-5. They didn't. That's negligence. Okay. If you're not making a DSM-5 diagnosis in these cases, you're asserting there is no diagnosable pathology present. So you're asserting there is no delusional disorder. There is no factitious disorder imposed on the child, because otherwise you would have diagnosed that. But they're not competent to do that. So I'm starting to unpeel these layers of incompetence. Then, as I encountered the forensic psychologists, it became not only are they in violation of standard 2.01 boundaries of competence, they're in violation of 2.04 of the APA Ethics Code for bases for scientific and professional judgments, because they're relying on parental alienation or nothing at all. And so since this is child abuse, they're failing in their duty to protect the child. In addition, this is spousal abuse using the child as a weapon. So they're failing in their duty to protect the spouse from spousal abuse. Well, that's a problem. Okay. Now here's a extremely dangerous thing about this specific pathology, a shared persecutory delusion and child abuse. Because if, as a doctor, if as a mental health professional, you believe the shared delusion as if it was true, you become part of the shared delusion. You become part of the pathology. You, the doctor, the psychologist, are part of the shared delusion because you believe it's true. Now, if that pathology is the psychological abuse of the child, then you become a participant in the psychological abuse of the child. You become a participant in the child abuse because you are practicing beyond the boundaries of competence and misdiagnosed the delusion. If it's spousal abuse using the child as a weapon, you also become part of the spousal abuse of the targeted parent by the allied parent because boundaries of competence, you misdiagnosed a persecutory delusion because you don't know what that is and don't know how to assess for it. Boundaries of competence. So, this is around 2010. I spent around 28 to 2010 just reading the literature, figuring out what's going on in the family court. So, around 2010, it became evident that the forensic psychologists are participants in the child abuse, are participants in the spousal abuse. The forensic psychologists are child abusers working in the family courts, and they are spousal abusers using the child as a weapon in the family courts because they are ignorant, lack knowledge or information, and incompetent. Boundaries of competence 2.01, 2.04, in delusional thought disorders, factitious disorders, attachment pathology, and child abuse and complex trauma. Wow, that's bad. When the psychologists are child abusers. What am I going to do about that? I have duty to protect obligations. Okay, so it's not just with my clients, there's a broader general public kind of comes in with a homicide, dangerous pathology, and duty to warn. But we have duty to protect for general population as well. And here I've got active child abuse and active spousal abuse in the family courts. That's pretty bad. And so I've got duty to protect on that alone. And I've got the psychologists participating in the child and spousal abuse as being co-child abusers. That is so bad. How did that happen? How did these psychologists become child abusers in the family courts? So I looking into what they think they're doing. Okay, and so that's why I got Stahl and Simon's book, 2013. I looked around for all the books on how to conduct a forensic custody evaluation. Stahl and Simon, published by the American Bar Association, work product review and things. And so I said, okay, they describe it. They're the ones that are foremost in advocating for this forensic custody approach. So let's see what they're doing. So I started to read their book. I was into chapter 2, and it became evident what they're doing. They left the field of clinical psychology. So just like Gardner gave himself permission to leave the diagnostic systems, forensic psychologists did the same thing. They gave themselves permission to leave established practice of diagnosis and treatment, clinical psychology. And I got the quotes from chapter 2 of their book, where they say they disagree with the clinical approach and we have a forensic mindset that's more objective and clinical is, subjective. All that's a straw man. No, it's not. They're just making stuff up. Clinical psychology depends on diagnosis and guides treatment. Okay, diagnosis and treatment. And so they picked out humanistic psychology of Carl Rogers it's one little pocket and said, oh, they're biased because they do the therapeutic relationship, whereas we don't and we're objective. That's a big straw man. So I'm willing at any point, I'll debate the role of forensic and clinical psychologists in the family courts. They said, Stahl and Simon, and then 2020 Simon and Stahl, said forensic psychology is superior to clinical psychology. take exception to that. Heavens no. They say, I got the quote, that the clinical mindset is not appropriate for the family courts. I absolutely disagree with that. I would say the forensic mindset is not appropriate for the family courts, the quasi-judicial role. So they're saying we have a new quasi-judicial role that's more appropriate. I'm going to say, no, it's not. It's really bad, and we need to have clinical. Let's debate it. Public online debate hosted by the AFCC, the role of forensic and clinical psychology in the family courts. I'll represent for clinical. Pick any forensic psychologist you want to argue in favor of their approach. Let's do that. But right now, you're just leaving that side of the argument unchallenged, that they're somehow better when they're not. They're awful, awful, awful approach. Here's what happened. They experimented on children and parents in the family courts. That's so bad. They experimented with a new quasi-judicial role for doctors. There's no quasi-judicial role for doctors. Doctors diagnose and treat pathology since the first of time. Okay, since witch doctors back in our tribes, all the way up to physicians and doctors forever diagnose and treat pathology. There's no quasi-judicial role for doctors until divorces started happening in the 80s, and these forensic psychologists went in and kicked the clinical psychologists out. How did that happen? The forensic psychologists got on the licensing boards. So any complaint that's coming in out of the family courts goes over to the forensic psychologist. If a clinical psychologist is involved, they will sanction the license of a clinical psychologist because you're not doing their forensic custody evaluation. So they will drive away the clinical psychologist by making it dangerous to their license to be in the family courts, because they're not doing what we're doing, our new experimental approach. So, oh my goodness. So I've got dangers from the pathology. I've got the forensic psychologist participating in the abuse and using their power on the licensing boards to drive away the clinical psychologist by making it dangerous to their license. Yikes. And if I stay in the family courts, I'm going to be at risk from the forensic psychologists who are going to want me to go away, especially when I expose their ignorance and incompetence. That's going to be a narcissistic injury to their narcissistic grandiosity, that they're doing something special and they're objective, and a sense of entitlement, that they are just entitled to make up these new experimental approaches, a new experimental role, and then a new experimental assessment procedure, custody evaluation for their new role. It's not a clinical diagnostic assessment. That's entitlement. Grandiosity. They think they can just do this, and they somehow have special knowledge, and they don't need to apply the APA ethics code. It doesn't apply to them. Oh my goodness gracious. Okay, so I got a narcissistic group of forensic psychologists, special psychologists, and they're in charge of everything. And they're abusing their clients. They're abusing the child. They're abusing the parent. And they're in control of the licensing boards, driving away the clinical psychologists. That's bad. So what do I do about that? So that's around 2012 or 2010 that I began to recognize this and then plot out. Once I developed the diagnosis of what's going on in the family courts, then I can now develop the interventions for the systems that will correct the systems. The experimental part of what they did was deeply troubling to me, because there was a point when I was back at UCLA with Keith Nectarline. One of the patients started to raise complaints about the research or the protocols of the research. And informed consent kinds of things became an issue. relative to informed consent for schizophrenic patients while they're actively schizophrenic. So Keith Nectarline tasked me with the job of doing a lit review on informed consent, okay, specifically around schizophrenia, but more broadly informed consent. And where that comes from is off of the World War II, and with the medical experiments by the Nazis on the people in the concentration camps. And after that, the medical profession, the doctors, became very sensitive about doing things to people without their consent. And so they wrote this Belmont report, and that's the origins primarily of the informed consent issue, that we don't do things to people without and telling them what we're going to do and without them agreeing to what they do. And informed consent for research, I've worked research projects. Absolutely, we need informed consent. And we avoid coercion of consent, especially within the vulnerable population that would be considered like in prison. So we can't do certain things with prison populations because they're vulnerable, and we can coerce them. We can't say, we'll give you time off if you participate in our research study that may kill you, because they're motivated to get the time off, and that's coercive. And so research consent is sensitive, and I'm familiar with all of this stuff. So what the forensic custody evaluators did, that is an abomination to me, is they conducted this experiment on parents and children in the family courts of this new quasi-judicial role that doesn't exist. There's no research support for it. And they developed a new assessment procedure for their new made-up role, these custody evaluations, and experimented on the children and parents in the family courts with their new experimental approach. And they did not inform the courts or the parents that there was an experimental approach, and they did not give them an alternative of standard care of clinical diagnostic assessment. They should have given the courts and parents a choice. If you want standard clinical diagnostic care, we can get you that. Or if you want to try this new quasi-judicial role in forensic custody, we can do that. It's going to be better. But they didn't offer this one. They only gave the courts and the parents one choice. And if a clinical person came in, they would sanction their license to go away. That's bad. Now, if their experiment works, they're heroes. Oh my goodness, they solved the family court. If it doesn't, which it hasn't, they are responsible for the destruction of the lives of the children and the parents for 40 years that they experimented on. How were they allowed to experiment? Where is the oversight? Where are the licensing boards? Geez, they're corrupted by the forensic psychologists are on the licensing boards, which makes it extraordinarily dangerous for me as a clinical psychologist coming into a world where they have all the power and the power to sanction. Well, where's the APA? Why did the APA allow them to conduct an experiment without proper safeguards on a vulnerable population? Oh, geez. The forensic psychologists have corrupted the decision-making of the APA. They're in the positions of power there, too. We got active child abusers on the licensing boards and the APA who are disabling the mental health system response for their own financial and career status gain. Yikes. I know this in 2010. After doing my kind of analysis of what's going on over here, we have these PAS supposed allies who are ignorant and just this ragtag group of people who are keeping the field locked forever in conflict around this made-up pathology proposal. That's just awful. And we got child abusers and spousal abusers working in the family courts and giving themselves absolute immunity for whatever they do, and there's no oversight of them. Well, what am I going to do about that? This is where the APA ethics code comes in. I have standard 1.04 and 1.05. The APA ethics code is mandatory for all psychologists. The problem with the forensic psychologists is boundaries of competence 2.01 and bases for scientific and professional knowledge 2.04. Both the violations to that lead to a violation in 9.01 bases for assessment, since their opinions are not based on information and techniques sufficient to substantiate their findings, citing back to 2.04. So I've got 3 ethical violations. I can also add avoiding harm, because they are participating in the child abuse, and that's foreseeable harm if you misdiagnose pathology. So I've got avoiding harm 3.04. So I got 4 ethical violations on the forensic psychologists, where there should be none. We can also add principle D, a very principle of ethics, justice, that requires equal access and equal quality in services. Well, at $20,000 to $40,000, these forensic custody evaluations are not providing equal access. Only the wealthy, well-to-do clients can afford them. And if you can't afford a custody evaluation, you get some sort of low-level mediation kind of assessment in a day that can, well, if they're proposing we need these custody evaluations to make a custody, then we shouldn't be making any of these others. We should always have this if we need it. But they're just exploiting financial. And if you can't afford what I got, then we don't care what you get. You get crap unless you get our custody evaluation of $20,000 to $40,000. It's financial exploitation, pure and simple, of a vulnerable population who has impaired autonomy because of the court's decision making. They need mental health services. They need a treatment plan. They need to fix things, and they're not getting it. Instead, these forensic psychologists are taking money. Equal quality. Because there's no applied knowledge, there's no inter-rater reliability. And I looked for that in the research. Where's your inter-rater reliability? That would be consistency across custody evaluators. There is none. So different evaluators will reach different conclusions based on the same information. There is no equal quality to the services rendered in custody. And then you got equal quality between custody evaluations and mediator reports. It's just awful. So we got violations to equal quality and equal access under Principle D, and 4 ethical violations by the forensic psychologists. And that's the problem. Okay. We need to return to clinical practice of diagnosis and treatment, and this unethical practice of this experiment on parents needs to be ended. It's a failed experiment. I'm not going to be a welcome person within forensic psychology, with carrying this message from clinical psychology, and they have all the power, and they have the licensing boards, and they have the AFCC, and they have 40 years, and I have none. I'm not working the family courts. I've been out in clinical psychology. But I have standard 1.04 and 1.05. 1.04 says when I believe there's been an ethical violation by another psychologist, I have a mandatory required obligation to informally make them aware of my concerns. Okay. Well, I have concerns about all the forensic psychologists, standard 1.04, and so I have obligations to informally notify them when I encounter them. So that's present as I encounter them. In addition, I have 1.05, which says if the problem isn't amenable to resolution through informal notification, which it's not, because we got all the forensic psychologists participating in this, so I can't go around notifying each one individually. So 1.05 applies, or it's not properly resolved in that fashion, which is currently the case as well. I'm notifying people it's not being currently resolved. So 1.05 is active. that I take further action appropriate to the situation. What is that further action appropriate to the situation? Then the APA Ethics Code 1.05 offers some suggestions: filing licensing board complaints or taking it to the organizations or appropriate organizations or institutions. What are the appropriate organizations or institutions? AFCC and APA. So you can see I've done that. I did a conference presentation to the AFCC, and then I did a position to the APA. So I'm fulfilling my obligations under 1.05. But that's the situation as I'm sitting, I'm kind of falling down the rabbit hole here. I've landed at the bottom, looking at the various options of what am I going to do about my psychologists being child abusers and being spousal abusers, and they are in control of the mental health system and are disabling the mental health system response in the family courts. And I am just a single lone psychologist. And so that's where I found a little bottle that says, "Drink me." So the APA Ethics Code, boop, drink me. And I went through the door into the family courts, armed with the APA Ethics Code to fix things. And here's the important thing about the APA Ethics Code. There's a reason for ethical standards of practice. Each one of those ethical standards of practice, there's a reason for them. I've taught law and ethics at the graduate level. I've taught ethics. And I was taught by a great ethics professor, Dr. Jenkins. There's a reason for each ethical standard. And violation of any ethical standard will cause harm. There will be some sort of problem because of that. There's a reason they are required and mandatory. The reason for 2.01, and you can ask the doctors, the forensic psychologists on the witness stand, ask them why the boundaries of competence is required. What would be the bad thing that would happen if your doctor is not competent? Misdiagnosis. And when it's a diagnosis of shared delusion and child abuse, then misdiagnosis, you become part of the shared delusion. You become part of the child abuse. Okay? That's the danger when you disregard the ethics code and just start to make things up and believe you're exempt from the ethics code, that you're entitled to simply make things up. You're not. And so that's armed with the APA Ethics Code, drink me, boop, and I went through the door into Wonderland. And so next time we can talk about all the curious critters and creatures and events and things I've had during my journey through Wonderland, trying to get back out of the rabbit hole and back to reality. So with that, I'm going to wrap up my talk today, and we'll talk about going into Wonderland next time and all the adventures that this clinical psychologist has had over